This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 916 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog, thanks for tuning in. When there's a waiver wire player who has a completely insane game, I really hope that I mention him on the Sleeper Show. And last week with Jauan Jennings, that was fortunately the case. He was one of the sleepers from that episode. And to be honest, I think last week's episode was the best one of the season. There were the typical misses. Greg Dortch actually had decent peripherals, but he didn't have a strong day of production. Hunter Henry really disappointed, Jordan Whittington didn't see the exact role that I thought that he would see, and D'Onta Foreman wasn't used like he was in week 2. But there was a lot of good. I mentioned Jauan Jennings already, that was a big hit. But I also talked about Sam Darnold, who was a top 10 quarterback option. Chuba Hubbard had a big day. Bucky Irving was fine. Cam Akers was okay. Jalen Tolbert and Jalen Naylor both scored touchdowns. And Michael Wilson was solid too. It was an 8 out of 10 week. I'll take it. We're on to week 4. Before getting into things, I want to remind you to check out Underdog. Underdog's a great place to play fantasy sports with so many different offerings that will definitely fit what you're looking for. Right now, if you sign up over there, you'll get a nice deposit offer, a free pick that'll help you win some cash, and then you also get my rest of season rankings. Those rest of season rankings are updated every Tuesday through the end of the year. You get access to all of those updates. So make sure you take advantage of those offers. Head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. And when you sign up, use promo code LATEROUND. Now let's get to this week's sleepers. Sam Darnold is right at the fringe for this first tier of players. I'm looking at guys rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues, and Darnold is right around that 50% mark. But I actually prefer Geno Smith to Sam Darnold this week, straight up. So we'll start there. Geno gets the Lions here in week 4. That game's sitting with a respectable 47.5 point total. Detroit's been pretty average for quarterbacks this year when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed, but they've been good against running backs. And that's forced teams to have the 6th highest neutral script pass rate in the league against the Lions. Now, there's a chance that we see even more passing than usual from this Seahawks offense this week. And Seattle's already a top 5 team in pass rate over expected. That's going to help a player like Geno. Justin Fields is also in here this week. We haven't seen as much rushing production from him to start the year, and his yards per carry is well below his career average. There are reasons for that, but it's a number that's probably going to rise as we move forward in the season. Pittsburgh gets Indianapolis. The Colts are the 12th best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted fantasy points allowed. They also rank in the bottom 10 at generating quarterback pressure. And Fields currently has a top 10 quarterback grade over on PFF when kept clean this year. Fields has actually been a top 5 quarterback this season according to Next Gen Stats and completion rate over expected. I think he's in a pretty good spot. And then the last quarterback to call out here, who's surprisingly above the 10% mark, is Andy Dalton. I just figured that people wouldn't be super aggressive with Dalton, but he balled out last week, so it makes sense. Dalton gets his old team when he goes up against Cincinnati this weekend, and the Bengals have been an above average matchup for quarterbacks to start the season. Dalton's coming off a top 10 performance where he shredded the Raiders, and the Bengals-Panthers game has the 2nd highest game total on this week's slate. For real. Carolina's got the 13th best implied team total. Cincinnati's been pretty below average across the board from a defensive perspective. They're bottom half in the league in pressure rate, and as a defensive unit, they've allowed the 5th highest EPA per play. So with Dalton, you're just playing into the fact that this is an above average matchup, and he looked good last week. Now moving on to running back, I think Rico Dowdle makes sense against the Giants on Thursday night. Dowdle saw an increase in running back rush share of about 20 percentage points from weeks 1 and 2 to week 3. And he's now hit a double-digit percentage target share in each of his last 2. The Giants have been a pretty ordinary matchup for backs this year, and Dallas is the 5th highest team total on this week's slate, so he's not a bad flex option. Justice Hill is another interesting one. Baltimore gets Buffalo, and the Bills rank 6th so far in adjusted target share allowed to running backs this year. Hill ranks in the top 20 in the league so far in route participation. He comes in ahead of guys like Aaron Jones and Tony Pollard. This is also a game where, hypothetically, Baltimore could trail, just given the way that Buffalo's playing. If that happens, you're going to see more Justice Hill on the field. So in PPR formats, I don't think he's a terrible play. The last running back from this tier is Braylon Allen, who's still under that 50% mark. There will be games for the Jets this year where Allen's not used nearly as much as he was last week because game script just goes south. Sort of like we saw in week 1 against the 49ers. But the Jets get the Broncos this week, and they're pretty big favorites. They're favored by more than a touchdown. So if that game goes as planned, we'll probably see Allen with another 30-ish% running back rush share. We have to be a little bit concerned about his pass catching ceiling, but he's looked great, and he's earned himself a role in that offense. It doesn't hurt that Denver's been a fine opponent for running backs thus far too. Now at wide receiver, let's go back to a guy I talked about on the 15 Transaction Show, and that's Romeo Doubs. Doubs has run the most routes on the Packers this season. He's going to be on the field, and Jordan Love, he could easily be back too. Minnesota's not the easiest opponent, but those two things mean there's the potential for fantasy points. Now, Jaden Reed got all the love in week 1 because he had that monster performance against Philadelphia. But Doubs led the Packers in target share with a 22% share. He's a solid option for a decent floor each week. Darnell Mooney was another one that I mentioned on the 15 Transactions episode, and the Falcons get the Saints this week. Mooney has seen target shares of 24% and 30% over his last 2 games. And New Orleans has seen above average percentage of targets go to wide receivers this year versus other positions. He's a fine play to get you some production, similar to a guy like Romeo Doubs. Now, I've got 2 slot players who are interesting this week. The first one is Wan'Dale Robinson. He's run 79% of his routes from the slot this year, resulting in a strong 24.5% target share. His ceiling isn't crazy because he has this 4.4 average depth of target, but Dallas, for what it's worth, they've ranked 8th this year in adjusted slot rate allowed to wide receivers. That just looks at the percentage of wide receiver targets that goes to the slot, and it adjusts for strength of opponent. So I think Robinson is fine as like a wide receiver 4 type. And then Josh Downs is another slot guy who's kind of interesting. I say it all the time, but Pittsburgh continually is terrible against slot wideouts. And Downs returned in week 3, and he played the slot for the Colts. He ran 100% of his routes from that area of the field. And he saw a target on 31% of his routes run. That's technically a top 10 number in the league right now. But it's a good matchup, and the Colts need to get something going through the air. Keeping it safe out of the slot in this kind of matchup makes plenty of sense. Now at tight end, I only have one guy for you in this tier, and it's Cardio Conklin himself, Tyler Conklin. Conklin finally saw his route participation match his target share in week 3. He saw an 18% target share after running a route on 95% of New York's dropbacks. On the season, no tight end has a better route participation than Tyler Conklin does. He gets Denver this week. Now, it could be an ugly, low-scoring game, but the Broncos have been a top 10 opponent for tight ends so far this year in adjusted fantasy points allowed, and they rank 5th in adjusted target share allowed to the position. So I think Conklin works once again. This next group of players consists of guys who are rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues. I don't have a quarterback for you in this group, but I have running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. So let's start at running back, and let's start with Roschon Johnson. I had him as an ad on the 15 Transaction Show because number 1, DeAndre Swift has been arguably the worst running back in football to start the season. And then that leads to number 2, Roschon Johnson seeing season highs in running back rush share, snap share, and target share in week 3. The Bears are facing the Rams this week. LA's been an average opponent for running backs this season when looking at things like adjusted fantasy points allowed. But teams in neutral script environments against them have been more run heavy. They rank 5th lowest in neutral script pass rate defensively. Johnson may see a bigger share week over week, which means he could score some fantasy points. Now, I didn't talk about Cam Akers earlier, and that's because Dameon Pierce may or may not be out. So I'll just throw it in this section because Dameon Pierce is rostered in fewer than 5% of leagues. Cam Akers is not, though. If Pierce is back, this backfield could be a mess, but it does make Pierce somewhat of an interesting dart. If he's not back, then expect Cam Akers to see a lot of work once again. He wasn't overly efficient in week 3, but he did see 82% of Houston's running back rushes and a respectable 7% target share. The Texans face the Jags this week too, which is a much easier matchup than what they had last week. Jacksonville's been the 5th best matchup for running backs so far this year in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Jaylen Warren may not go this week. That would really help Najee Harris become a bell cow in that offense. But Cordero Patterson could easily see some work too, especially as a pass catcher. Indianapolis has been a good matchup for running backs to start the year. they're 7th worst in adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. Pittsburgh's also been a top 5 team in running back target share. So I would not be surprised at all if Cordero Patterson sees 10 touches in this game. That's as long as Jaylen Warren is out. At wide receiver in this tier, I'm interested to see how Carolina deploys their wide receivers with Adam Thielen out. My guess is that Jonathan Mingo takes on a lot of the slot work. He actually played a lot of slot in college. But Xavier Legette, he might get a little bit of run there too. Both are okay dart throws this week, and I'm talking more desperation. But whoever ends up on the outside, which in my opinion, that's probably going to be Legette, that player could have an easier time here in week 4. When adjusted for opponent, Cincinnati has seen wide receiver targets go to the slot at a bottom 5 rate this year. This could be a Deontay Johnson game for sure. Don't be surprised if he has like a 30-35% target share. But I think another Panthers pass catcher might get involved. I'd say it's Legette over Mingo given deployment, but we don't have all the information that we need yet. I'm also going to go back to Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch this week. Arizona's in a game against Washington, and as I talked about on the 10 Trends episode, the Commanders have the worst secondary in football. They're the best matchup for wide receivers that you can find. They've seen a lot of production to the perimeter, so Michael Wilson, in my eyes, is the better play over Greg Dortch, but Dortch isn't a terrible look in deeper formats. The bottom line, you want a piece of this Arizona passing attack. Now, Demario Douglas is the last wide receiver that I want to call out here. The Patriots finally used Douglas more in week 3. He saw 38% target share after being at 13% and 0% over his first 2 games. The 49ers are probably going to keep the Patriots score down. They're not going to score a lot of points. But the 49ers are a team that's seen a decent chunk of their wide receiver targets go to the slot this season. They're 11th in adjusted slot rate allowed. And for what it's worth, thanks to some big plays, they've allowed the highest yards per route run to slot wideouts. So Douglas is interesting in a possible negative game script against the 49ers. At tight end in this tier, I think looking at Tucker Kraft might work. We saw him get more run than Luke Musgrave the last time we saw Jordan Love play, which was back in week 1, and Minnesota ranks 9th in adjusted target share surrendered to tight ends. They're also 5th in adjusted points allowed to the position. It's risky because we don't know exactly how the Packers want to run their tight ends. It might change weekly, but he does make some sense logically. Now, the last sleeper this week is Tommy Tremble. He ran around on 77% of Andy Dalton's dropbacks last week. And while that led to just a 9% target share, there's a chance that Adam Thielen's injury allows for that share to rise. This is really just a play on the fact that he got some good run last week and the Bengals aren't an overly scary matchup. He's a pretty deep play though. As for our defensive streamers, it's not an easy week. I said it earlier in the week that I think that Vegas works against Cleveland. I still think that's true. That game is a 37-point total, and Cleveland's been the best matchup for opposing defenses this year. I also don't mind New Orleans against Atlanta, and then Tennessee against Miami, given that quarterback situation for the Dolphins. But again, it's not an easy week for streaming defenses. Lastly, let's do some pick'ems over on Underdog. It's been a tough start to the season because scoring has just been down so much across the league. And I'm only looking at the optimistic side of these picks because I'm using guys from this sleeper show and I'm looking at them favorably. But let's keep riding. The first one is higher than 172.5 passing yards for Justin Fields. He's only been above that mark once this year, but Indy's a good matchup and Indy plays with some pace. Next, I'm going to go higher than 34.5 receiving yards for Wan'Dale Robinson. He could be targeted at a decently high rate given the matchup. And then lastly, we'll go with a long shot. We'll say that Josh Downs finds the end zone. Like I said, I like his slot matchup too against Pittsburgh. You guys can use those picks or not use those picks, whatever you want to do, over on Underdog. But if you do use them, make sure you sign up with promo code LATEROUND because you'll get those offers that I talked about earlier on the show, including that deposit bonus. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. As usual, I'll have the mailbag episode out tomorrow morning and then a Late Round Perspectives episode a little bit after that. Take care.